at the audience, except to tell them about other people and other things. But this morning, the presentation is aimed directly at you and me, at us and all Christians. It's not about people who are not here anymore. It's not about that was then and this is now. This is something for all Christians right now, for me and for you and for all of our fellow Christians. It's the late, Great Commission. Now, some years ago, quite a few years ago now, you remember Hal Lindsey in his book, The Late Great Planet Earth? Most people remember that. Hal Lindsey hit a nerve. He saw, his vision was that the Bible speaks about the future of this planet very clearly, but people were thinking elsewhere. It was something almost hidden. They didn't get it. And Hal Lindsey was able to capture the imagination of the whole populace and sold millions and millions of copies of that book. Well, there's another issue that's right up front and clear that Christians should really be aware of, and there's an issue that would be comparable to a family's financial situation for retirement or serious illness in the home. There's a serious issue here for Christians relating to the Great Commission. And I'd like us to look at that together just a little bit. If we think back to Resurrection Week, Easter week, that was an exciting time. And even in our scriptures, in our New Testament scriptures, it's very interesting, it's very moving to read about the essential core actions of our Christian faith. For example, on Crucifixion Friday at 3 o'clock, in the year 30 or 33, Jesus Christ was crucified. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all began to focus on that final week and the next 40 days. So, early Sunday morning, Christ arose from the dead. He appeared to Mary Magdalene and some others of his very closest disciples and followers. And then Sunday afternoon, he appeared to those two persons on the Emmaus walk from Jerusalem to that nearby town of Emmaus. And then Sunday night, as the apostles, the 11 apostles, were gathered together in secret behind a locked door because of all the turmoil about Christ's body having been moved from the tomb, Christ appeared to them, but just to the 10, because Thomas wasn't there. So then, the next week, at the same time, on Sunday evening, they were gathered together and Thomas was there, and Jesus appeared. Now, doubting Thomas, well, if you can win over doubting Thomas and have him say, "My Lord and my God," then you have given Christians for all generations, for all these centuries, a lot of ammunition to present the gospel to unbelievers and skeptics, etc. But there was something else that happened during those 40 days, some really important command. And I'd like to have you, if you have your Bibles with you, all four Gospels begin to focus on what we have been calling the Great Commission. It's one of the clearest commands that Christ gave to his apostles. There is no missing the clarity of the Great Commission. I'm going to start with Mark 16:14. And Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and for their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. Now, there's a little theme here working. Jesus is not slow to criticize the apostles for their lack of faith and obedience. And that's where it begins to start turning towards us. We as Christians, if we're not careful, we're going to qualify for, "O ye of little faith, why didn't you believe? Why didn't you obey? Why didn't you do what I commanded you to do?" Oh, looks like the situation is falling apart here, but we'll survive it for sure. So what I'm leading up to is, when Jesus gave the Great Commission, it was very clear what the disciples were to do. And they started off and turned the world upside down in that first century, so that by the end of the century, there were churches all over Turkey, Greece, Assyria, Mesopotamia, Iraq, Iran. There were churches everywhere. And you can look in a good Christian atlas, and it'll give you a big picture with little symbols indicating where Christian churches were. That whole area got covered with the gospel, with the Great Commission, during that first century. Following that first century, things seemed to ebb off. The apostles were very successful in the accounts that we have of the evangelism of Philip and I'm thinking of the 7 deacons, and things went very well and continued to go very well for almost a century. But then persecution began to rise higher and higher. The 12, after Matthias had been added to take the place of Judas, the 12 fanned out and began the message all over the biblical world. They had a lot of success. But persecution rose up immediately. And persecution came from the Jewish religious establishment and from the Jewish leaders of the nation. Now let's go back to a little bit of some of the things that were covered in the presentation just before us. God had this plan from the beginning, and we don't get a lot of details on the period from the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, until the flood. We know it was a period of about 1,600 years, and we know quite a little bit about it. But the most thing that sticks out for us in the book of Genesis is there was a rising tide of evil, so that at the beginning of that period, there were many men and women who knew the Lord, and there were some who had walked and talked with the Lord, and they lived for hundreds of years. Methuselah lived, 969 years. And Adam lived a long, long time. And they actually told people of their experiences. So people knew God, they knew the Lord at the beginning. But during those years leading up to the flood, people turned away from the Lord. And the flood came as a judgment on all those small groups that had started out as families, and then tribes, and then new nations, and they had all departed from the Lord. Now, key passage is Genesis 6. There's a whole lot there, I think, that still needs to be exegeted out of the scriptures. But Genesis 6 tells us of evil so great that God decided to wipe out those generations before the flood. They were wiped out, taken off the earth. And then after the flood, there was a fresh start with Noah and his family. But even then, after 2, 3, 4, 500 years, the peoples of the earth had turned the same way as the pre-flood people. They had all gotten away from the Lord. So then God called Abram and began this plan to have a worldwide evangelization. Through you, Abraham, all the nations will be blessed. And he took Abraham and the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and he trained them in spiritual things. It was like a boot camp of training in spiritual things. But the patriarchs essentially failed. They ended up down in Egypt where the Lord had told them and advised them not to go. So God rescues these people from Egypt, and he forms a new nation at Mount Sinai. So we have Israel. And then from that point on until John the Baptist, God is preparing Israel for a great mission, and that's what we call the Great Commission. The nation Israel was to learn the ways of God and then share them with all the other nations. And this is really clear when we read these accounts of the Great Commission that Jesus gave to the 12. And so the nation Israel was commissioned to be the nation to bring blessing to all the other nations. And they started out well. And we have that story in the book of Acts, especially the first 12 chapters of Acts. But gradually we see in the progression the increase of persecution and the backing off of the Hebrew Christians. It came to a point when Israel was set aside. It came to a point when Israel said no more. It came to a point when they backed off of spreading the gospel around the world. I think you can almost see a particular day that was the last straw that broke the camel's back. And that was the day when Stephen, one of the 7 deacons, who God had blessed so greatly with a message that no one could confront Stephen. No one could over-argue him. Wherever he went, synagogue to synagogue, he triumphed in spreading the gospel. He also worked the miracles that Jesus said would accompany the 12. But when the Sanhedrin, representing the leading governmental power of Israel, brought Stephen before them and questioned him for his preaching of the gospel, and when he gave that message in Acts 7, the message of Stephen to the Sanhedrin, they were beyond themselves. And they said, "You must die." And they dragged Stephen out of Jerusalem and stoned him to death. And you remember the account. As Stephen was dying and being stoned, he said, "Father, forgive them," just like Jesus had said from the cross. And he said, "I can see Jesus standing at the right hand of God the Father on the throne." Now, this is a very big biblical incident, a very significant transition from the nation Israel having been given a command and commission to reach the world, and they're saying no. And I think on that day, the nation was formally, officially set aside. Temporarily, of course, as Paul is going to explain in Romans and elsewhere. God is not through with the Jews, but on that day, in that time, they had quit. I remember years and years ago, there's probably not anyone here old enough to remember, I was never a fan of boxing. I thought that was the most stupid sport there ever was. But I was always fascinated with Joe Louis and Max Schmeling and all the boxers. And I was watching a prize fight one night, and it was one of the most famous boxing matches in history. And it was between Alberto Duran, I think, and Sugar Ray Robinson. And all of a sudden, in about the 9th round of this very closely contended fight, Duran put up his hands and said, "No mas, no more, I quit." Well, I think that's a whole lot what Israel did. I've always thought Israel had a pretty tough row to hoe in the Old Testament. The tremendous requirements of the Mosaic Law and God holding them to account more than any other nation, preparing them for this great mission. But it seemed to have been a failure. Well, there were 2 evangelistic parties in the book of Acts and in the first century. One was led by Peter and James and the apostles, and one was led starting halfway through the book of Acts when God reached down and picked the largest persecutor of the church, being, who would that be? Paul, although then he was Saul the rabbi. So Saul was leading the persecution of the church, putting people into prison, and in some cases Christians were being martyred and killed. So as Paul and Barnabas and Silas and Timothy and Titus and a whole new group of Christians conducted their evangelistic enterprise, they were growing and doing really, really well. Now, Paul would go to Jerusalem after some years, and Paul and Barnabas went and took Titus with them, and they had a private big council meeting with Peter, James, and John, and the leaders in the Jerusalem church, and they kind of agreed that Peter and James and John would concentrate on Hebrews, and Paul and Barnabas and Silas would concentrate on the Gentiles. In fact, Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles, and they called this enterprise the Gentile mission. So as the Hebrew mission kind of wound down, was persecuted, and James was beheaded, and Peter was crucified upside down, and it just kind of petered off and came to an end with the 12 apostles and Peter, James, and John. But Paul and Barnabas and Silas and Timothy and Titus, they pushed on. They pushed out into Cilicia, Paul's hometown country. They went into Turkey. They covered the whole of Turkey. They crossed into Europe and covered Egypt and Macedonia, etc. Greece and Macedonia. And it was going really well. But you know, if we remember back, there's an illustration from the Old Testament that has relevance here. As Israel came out of Egypt at the Exodus, they had the leadership of Moses and Aaron and Joshua especially, and God was blessing, and they were moving forward successfully, defeating their enemies when they were loyal to God, etc. Went into the promised land and began to possess it. But you know, when Joshua died, and when his team of group that were around him, when they died, the nation went into a very serious decline. We call it the book covered in the book of Judges. And Israel began a falling away from God that lasted really from then on, really. I think of the example of Solomon. Solomon, as a young man, was just a very winsome person. His father, David, his mother, Bathsheba, a humble guy, two outstanding prayers in the Old Testament with Solomon as a young man when he said, Lord, give me wisdom. And he reached a height of godliness and wisdom, etc., an example to the nation, and the nation became enlarged and free and covered a lot of the promised territory. But then Solomon had a great fall. Solomon was won over by his wives and concubines. And Israel, from that moment on, from the time that Solomon died and his son took over and the kingdom divided, it was all downhill. All downhill until the Messiah came and with John the Baptist as the forerunner. So, let's see where this leaves us. It leaves us with this. It looks like the Great Commission given to Israel, then given to the Christian church under the leadership of Paul and the church, both of these movements ground to a virtual halt. Now, we have had many, many excellent, wonderful, hard-living, serving Christian missionaries. But over the years, actually, it was a long time before they really got started. Did you know that for 200 years after the Reformation, there were no Christian missionaries sent out? This is pointed out in one of the books on the table out there. When Calvinism and Lutheranism took over, it was all ecclesiastical and theological. It was not missions. I've noticed a number of statements in history books about how Calvin sent out missionaries and how that Calvinism was active in missionary work. That's not true. What they mean by missionaries are men trained at the academy who were sent to every capital of Europe and England and Great Britain to persuade them of Calvinism. It wasn't evangelistic at all. It was strictly indoctrination of Calvinism. And so it took the modern missionary movement, William Carey and Judson and that group, and they started afresh with the modern missionary movement, going to China, South America, Asia, everywhere. Great missionaries. And just a few years ago, in my memory, the churches that I was a member of, they would have annual missionary conferences, annual prophecy conferences. You don't see that so much anymore, especially the missionary conferences. So missions today is sort of moribund. It's sort of dead. I think it is. And people are not thinking about missions. Now, recently, as I have studied the scriptures, I've been impressed with something I hadn't seen before. I have had a fresh insight into the will of God as revealed in his plans and programs that to me have been set aside as people have gone the route of the academy. Let me explain that. The academy first refers to the school that Calvin and Beza set up in 1559. Now, Calvin was at the height of his career, and he was sort of the head man in charge, authoritarian, and Calvin was very authoritarian. He did not take slights lightly. People in Geneva were required, when addressing Calvin, to call him master. And you could be punished if you were speaking to Calvin and didn't use the word master. And when one of his enemies, I think the story is well known, but it's important to keep in mind, one of the opponents of Calvin was a doctor named Michael Servetus. And Michael Servetus was from Spain. And at that time, Spain had many Muslims and Jews. And Servetus was interested in reaching the Muslims and the Jews in Spain. And their problem was, their response to the efforts of the Christians, they could not accept the Trinity. And so Servetus studies the Trinity, and he thinks it could be better presented. And so he comes into conflict with the Spanish Inquisition, with the Catholic Church, and with Calvin and the others at Geneva. And they corresponded between each other, and those letters are still available. And Calvin said to one of his cohorts, Farrell, one of his the high leaders in Geneva, that if that man Servetus ever comes near into our city, he will not leave. Well, Servetus was on the run from the Catholics, and he was passing through Geneva on a Sunday, and he decided he would disguise himself a little bit and go to church and listen to Calvin speak. But he was recognized, and Calvin had him arrested. And in a matter of a few weeks and months, he had his trial, and he was burned at the stake. These were tough times, but it illustrated a lack of sensitivity to God and Christ and the Word. And that's reflected in the fact that today Christians are not worldwide as active as we should be. And the Great Commission is being unfulfilled. Now, I'd like to turn to a parable. I think it's Matthew 10. I missed my PowerPoints, I'll tell you. Matthew 10, the parable. And I've got one of these strange Bibles that's integrated, and Scripture is not in its own order, but it's been taken all out of its context here. Let me see if I can find this. This is Matthew 10. When my Bible fell off on the ground, it lost its place here. But excuse me just for a minute. I got the glasses, Matthew 10. Okay. Just brought my wrong presentation Bible with me. I think 1187. It's the parables of Jesus that have given me a fresh insight of things. And this is one. It's the parable of the workers sent out to the vineyard. Isn't that amazing? I can't even find that here. Matthew 20? I think that sounds right. But then I don't have... Workers vineyard. Yeah, it's Matthew 21 to 16. But then with this Bible here, you have to go to the back, Matthew 21, to get the page where it is. I just brought the wrong Bible with me. Yeah, Matthew 20. That would be 1225. Okay, yeah, I need that too. Thank you very much.
Giant print is like 14.
Okay, right. Yeah, it's this parable of the workers in the vineyard. And 10 minutes. Okay, we have to really move fast here. There is truth that Jesus gave in the parables and in the New Testament and Old Testament that we have lost sight of, I think. It's almost like it's clear and it's there, but it's hidden in plain sight. Now, we have to go really quick, but Jesus is talking about a landowner who went out early in the morning, before 6 a.m., to hire laborers for his vineyard. Now, he agreed to pay the laborers the working fee for a day's work of 1 denarius. And he sent them into his vineyard at 6 a.m. He went out again about the third hour and saw others, and he signed them up too. And then he went out at noon, he went out at the 6th and 9th hour, and he really went out again at 5 o'clock, 5 p.m., and he hired these workers to work in the vineyard. Well, they quit work about 7 or 8, and they lined up for their pay. And they started with the people who had worked the longest, and everyone got a denarius. But then the next group who had worked less, they also got a denarius. And then the last group who had worked only about an hour, they got a denarius. And the ones that worked all day complained. And the owner said, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go your way. If I wish to give to this last man the same as to you, that's up to me." Now, here's the application to the Great Commission. The church has phased out of obeying the Great Commission. I think this parable and a whole series of parables are teaching us things that, because we have shifted our attention from the Bible itself to the academy, meaning, oh yeah, I should have followed up on that sentence I started a few minutes ago. The academy first meant that school that Calvin founded. But then after Calvin died and as years went by, they used the term academy to refer to all scholarship, worldwide scholarship. We sometimes say, well, the academy says this or the academy says that. But what is dangerous about that is not all of the scholarship and the books, et cetera, that we have available to us, and many times so helpful. But if you set the academy on a higher level than the Word of God, you're making a big mistake. And that is the mistake that the church has made, in my view. Now, to bring this train of thought back together again, we in 2015 are like the workers that were called at 5 p.m. and the Lord gave them the opportunity to do work and be recompensed at that same rate as those who had labored all day. Now, I think that means this: if we as a church in this time at 2015, if we can start a refreshed renewal of the Great Commission as if we were starting late, the Lord will recognize that work and will help us. Now, there's several other parables that we are missing the impact of, I think, that say, when the Lord gives you an assignment and you obey that assignment, you will be blessed. The Lord will overflow with blessings for you. But if you disobey, when the Lord holds his accounting, you will be punished. Now, I think the church is standing at the crossroads right now. If we can begin as a church a movement to evangelize the world in the few remaining years, the few hours that are left, the Lord will reward us. But if we fail to do that, we, the church, we're going to be punished for it. As we look at a map today of the Middle East, and we see Turkey and Iraq and Iran covered with mosques, none of those Christian places are anything but ruins today. And the few struggling Christians are being persecuted and killed. That's not right. That's not good. Christians have got to rise up. And it's the challenge to rise up that will get us alive again. Because we're kind of in a bad slump as a Christian church. So that was the one part that I was going to share with you this morning. We're not going to have time for the second part. But I think I'm just going to stop there and say, we have people, young people especially, from all over the world, many countries, going to Iran and Iraq, not Iran, Iraq, to fight with ISIS. They're giving their lives, they're putting things on the line. We need young Christians who are able to put their lives on the line, like Paul and Barnabas and Titus and Timothy, and get the Great Commission on again and finish strong. That's a tremendous challenge for the church today. And I'm going to end with that. Any quick questions? I think we have a minute or two. Do we, Jeff, or not?
Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Okay, good. Comments or questions?
Okay, thank you very much.